I don't know about you, but when I think of parenting, I think it is the most engaging mental exercise that anybody could ever do. How do you encourage your kids to have fun with the place that they're at and the things that they're learning, but also have them have a standard of development and maturity and growth? And then when we have standardized tests, or you take your kids and even to the doctor, they're put on some kind of scale that shows where they are in the law of averages. And as a parent, it's hard sometimes because sometimes you feel like you're just falling short because your kids might not be at a place where they're achieving the 100th percentile. So, what do we do with that weight? How should we think about that? Should we look to the eras of the past to guide our future? Or should we have a different approach? Today on the Celebrate Kids podcast, in this daily segment, Facing the Dark, Dr. Kathy has some really important insights that are going to help walk us through this. And before we turn to Dr. Kathy, I just want to remind you that this episode of the Celebrate Kids podcast is brought to you by Summit Ministries. Summit does an amazing 2-week camp nearly every week during the summer, where kids really grow in their faith and their understanding of God and also mature really in profound ways, being a little bit on their own, but also being at a place where they're now picking up the Bible daily and asking big questions of learned people every night. It's really amazing. I'd like to encourage you to go and check out what Summit has to offer by going to summit.org/celebrate kids. That's summit.org/celebrate kids. And now we're going to jump into what Dr. Kathy has to encourage us with today.
Don't be afraid of the dark. Be careful with stars. Not every light is gonna guide you, baby. Not every light is gonna guide you.
So, Dr. Kathy, psychologists who popularized the idea of child development milestones in the late 1970s created kind of a soft outline for how many of us like our children to kind of be what is called sometimes infantilized, or really just to keep them as infants. There's an iconic list of these milestones that was created by Louise Bates Ames in her The Child Development Milestone Checklist for Kids age 6. The list is, will your child be 6 years, 6 months or older when he begins first grade and starts receiving reading instruction? Does your child have 2 to 5 permanent or second teeth? Can your child tell in such a way that his speech is understood by a school crossing guard or policeman where he lives? Can he draw or color and stay in the lines of the design that's being colored? Can he stand on one foot with eyes closed for 5 to 10 seconds? Can he or she ride a small bike without helper wheels? Can he or she tell left hand from right hand? Can he or she travel alone in the neighborhood 4 to 8 blocks to the store, school, playground, or to a friend's home? Can he or she be away from you all day without being upset? Can he or she repeat an 8 to 10 word sentence that you say once? An example would be, the boy ran all the way home from the store. Can he or she count 10 pennies correctly? Does your child try to write or copy letters or numbers? Dr. Kathy, I'll say it that this is really kind of a challenge for some kids. I mean, I don't know that my kids, as they're engaging first grade, if I set them down to do this, would naturally just leap at it. And sometimes we kind of set benchmarks that are really pretty hard for our kids. What do you make of this list? And should we be looking to the past, like what happened in the 1970s, to really guide an understanding of what our kids should be able to do today?
In some ways, absolutely not. In other ways, it's probably okay. As an example, can a 6-year-old travel alone in the neighborhood 4 to 8 blocks away? Most of us would not allow that today, but traffic is different. Some of us have children living in neighborhoods where you're not allowed out of the front yard. So that I would cross that one off the list. Most of our schools now start to teach reading in kindergarten, which I'm not actually a fan of. But so the first item you read would be, are they 6 years, 6 months or older when you begin first grade and start reading instruction? That one's irrelevant. And permanent teeth, that cracks me up because parents can't control that. So that's fascinating to me that even made the list. I would like to see parents know their children well enough to say, I think that they are mature enough emotionally. They have some social skills. They have some character that will allow them to be teachable when others ask them to do things. And therefore, I think they'll be okay out of the home. I also will say, Wayne, that it's almost impossible for a parent to know for sure if the children are ready, because we don't know what the schools expect of a kindergartner or a first grader. So this is why a school assessment, if you choose to send your children to a public or private school, that kindergarten assessment in the spring prior to the year they would enter school is really important. And then if that teacher who knows what typical 5 and 6-year-old kids are like says to the mom, hey, your child needs to be working on fine motor, hand coordination, so have them color more this summer, I think that's great. I think it's super hard for us to know for sure.
So, Dr. Kathy, I want to ask you something, because I think many of us might, ask this question. You talked about the level of reading, when we should kind of engage our kids to start reading. I think it's natural for us as parents to think, man, this summer, my kid's going to start reading before they enter, first grade or kindergarten or what have you. Why did you say that comment about us maybe having a different perspective or attachment to that as a benchmark for our kids to enter kindergarten or even first grade?
I would love for kindergarten to be about socialization and emotional maturity and joy in learning. And it can include the ABCs and the 1, 2, 3s and colors and shapes, like this is a square and this is a circle. But I feel like there are a lot of children who are experiencing pressure to already be reading. The purpose of kindergarten is to learn how school works, to learn about socialization, where you're now with 20 other 5-year-olds, especially boys who are kind of forced into a reading position early on and don't do well because their brains aren't fully developed yet, can then develop a perspective that school isn't fun and that reading is hard. Now mom and dad are stressed and now we use flashcards. Reading becomes important when you need to be able to read. Okay. So you need to be able to read your name when you have a locker at school that you need to put your lunchbox in. So Kathy is not Karen. That's when I learned to read Kathy is Kathy. Until you need to know something, you don't need to know it. And I would just rather have us read to our kids and experience the joy of listening vocabulary. I could go on, but I'll leave it at that unless you have a follow-up question.
I always have a follow-up question, Dr. Kathy. I would like to say that's why you pay me to do these things, but I think it's more, this is just free counseling for me right now. So I love this. But I want to ask you kind of with that, it's naturally for us as parents to really gauge ourselves on the benchmarks that our kids are going to be looking at. I think some of that might be a little bit having to do with how we think the world is, kind of centered around us. You write about this in Screens and Teens, that we really do look at the world as kind of an efficiency exercise. And we want our kids to be efficient in school. And so that means that we're going to prepare them for that thing that they're going to do in school. And so we kind of run into these checklists, like what we see maybe from a school on what your kids should be ready to do. And it's really an assessment on, are we good parents? I would say. I mean, that's how I kind of read it, if I'm being completely honest. Did I do my job as a parent to prepare my kid now for the school or for the test that they're going to receive from someone who's outside of our home or out in, education land somewhere? I don't even know where those people live, right? Why does parents kind of taking these checklists as a we're good parents checklist maybe do a disservice to the kids? Does it do a disservice to the kids? Should we operate inside of some of these things and say, this is just kind of the way it is, and we need to be attentive as parents to do this? What are your thoughts with that a little bit?
That's complex, right? It is about the children. It's about the children becoming who God created them to be. Children are not given to parents so that they can perform for parents and make parents feel good about the job they're doing or look good to relatives, neighbors, and other people. I think if all parents know that eventually children need to be able to write their name and, count pennies and be able to read. Have you done your job there? Like when you set the table, do you say out loud when you put the forks on the table, 1 fork, 2, 3, 4? Do you see a billboard with the letter K? Back in the day when Kmart was, if you're old enough as you're listening to this to remember the store Kmart, when I taught kindergartners, when I student taught kindergartners, one of the first letters that we taught them was the letter K because of Kmart, because most of them have been to Kmart. They'd seen the signs and that big letter K and the billboard and all of that. So do you do environmental things? Is your church, apostles, and there's a capital A, and that's how you teach them letter A? Are you interacting with the environment, with your children who you recognize are getting old enough to begin academic pursuit? If you are, great job. If you're ignoring all of that and you're pretending like they're not old enough yet, then there will be some suffering that is going to take place because your children will find the introduction to a formal school education to be a more challenging thing.
Yeah, Dr. Kathy, I think that's really helpful to kind of think through. And before we go, I want to ask maybe a harder question for you, or maybe it's a harder question for me. I mean, the reality is that sometimes our kids are going to miss some of the benchmarks that these people or education or the medical community will set as this is kind of in the range of normal. What do moms and dads need to know, and how should we respond when our kids aren't hitting the mark with these different assessments?
The first thing I would say is that you haven't necessarily done anything wrong, and your children are not necessarily wrong. I would ask, who set the benchmark? Again, who set that? It's absolutely ridiculous to expect children from the inner city and children in rural America to care about the same things, to do the same kind of performances in school-based tasks. It depends on if you've got older siblings or younger siblings. It depends on if you have a mom and a dad both at home with time in their hands to read to kids and to point out things like the letter K on a billboard. So it's grossly unfair to judge children and therefore the parents according to some standard without understanding what would be even possible in an environment that our kids are in. If a child is truly missing out, then the earlier we get help, the better. The earlier we get intervention, the better. There's no shame in a parent reaching out to a local school administrator or the director of the preschool, and you say, if your children are in a preschool setting, or maybe there's a Sunday school teacher, there's the director of the toddler room at your church, and you want to know, does my son Angelica seem to be confident here? Because at home, I've noticed that she whines quickly when there's a new task, and she doesn't seem to be confident when a new child comes over with a family for dinner, and she clings to me. Have you noticed, does Angelica do okay with you in the toddler room at the church? And if that toddler teacher says, oh yeah, she's fine, then it's a mommy-daughter issue, and it's a mommy hunger issue, and she's a little bit hesitant in front of you, which is very different from a child who cannot engage with people in any setting. So I think the wiser parent is observant and wonders, I wonder if something could be wrong. And then you don't obsess on it. You pray about it. Maybe you ask your mom or dad. Maybe you do that. Maybe you talk to a professional. Maybe you talk to your best friend. And maybe you observe other children when you're out and about to see if your assessment of your daughter or son might be real. This is hard. Firstborn kids, the guinea pig, this is not for faint of heart. Not at all.
As Dr. Kathy was talking, it reminded me of a passage that comes out of 1 Peter chapter 2, and I'm going to begin reading at verse 1. Therefore, rid yourselves of all malice and deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and slander of every kind. Like newborn babies, crave pure spiritual milk, so that by it you may grow up in your salvation, now that you have tasted that the Lord is good. And I think as parents, we want to really push our kids to grow up and be ready for the different things that they're going to experience in life. And with that, we want them to achieve at high rates and just do incredible things. And I think what Peter talks about here is really important for us to remember, that for many of our kids, it's okay for them to crave that understanding of being in a place where they can have fun and they can express joy. And not everything has to be a slog. And school can actually be a discipline of learning to love learning. And helping our kids walk through that can be really powerful in the same way that Peter talks about helping us as believers crave pure spiritual milk that we can grow up in our salvation with. Because for many of us, we have tasted and seen that the Lord is good. Could we drive our kids to that? Could that be a bright light that would help them cut through some dark confusion and some big challenges and maybe even some feelings of inferiority that they might be having? I hope that's an encouragement for you today, and I hope this whole podcast has been an encouragement for you this week. As a reminder, most of our podcasts this week were brought to you by Summit Ministries. It's a great place. My kids are going there here in a couple weeks, and I'm looking forward to seeing the teachers, the counselors, understanding a little bit of what they're doing inside of some of the lessons that they're going to be learning, and then to welcome them home and have some really deep conversations, because that's what they do at Summit. They talk about great, big, deep things. So check it out. Go to summit.org/celebrate kids. That's summit.org/celebrate kids. On behalf of Dr. Kathy Cook, my name is Wayne Stender. Thanks for listening with us this week, and I'm looking forward to seeing you here again on Monday.